Number 1. Gerard John Schaefer, a Florida police officer who used his badge to hunt, torture, and murder young women along the state's coastal highways. Gerard John Schaefer was born on March 25, 1946, in Neenah, Wisconsin, the eldest of 3 children born to a conservative Catholic family. His father worked as an executive at a paper company, and the family relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, when Schaefer was still a child. By all outward appearances, the Schaefer household was stable, middle-class, and unremarkable, but beneath the surface Gerard exhibited troubling behaviors from an early age. Neighbors and later classmates recalled that he had a fixation on violence toward women, often tying up neighborhood girls when they were children and engaging in cruel acts against animals. His mother was reportedly overbearing and emotionally volatile, creating a home environment where Gerard learned to mask his dark impulses behind a polite, soft-spoken exterior. He attended St. Pius X Catholic High School in Atlanta, where he was considered quiet and bookish, not particularly popular but not notably troubled either. After graduating in 1964, Schaefer briefly attended seminary with the intention of becoming a priest, a path his mother strongly encouraged, but he was ultimately expelled for reasons that have never been fully disclosed, though former seminary peers later suggested inappropriate behavior around women. Following his expulsion from the seminary, Schaefer drifted for several years, working various odd jobs before deciding to pursue a career in law enforcement. He moved to Florida in the late 1960s and eventually joined the Wilton Manors Police Department in Broward County in 1971. At the time, background checks for law enforcement were far less rigorous than they would become in later decades, and Schaefer's history of disturbing childhood behavior went undetected. He was described by his superiors as intelligent, articulate, and eager to please, though some fellow officers noted that he was socially awkward and had an unsettling intensity when discussing crimes involving female victims. Schaefer married a woman named Martha in 1970, and the couple settled in a modest home, but the marriage was troubled almost from the beginning. Martha later testified that Schaefer was controlling, emotionally abusive, and had bizarre sexual demands that made her deeply uncomfortable. She described instances where he would become enraged over minor provocations and then switch without warning to a cold, calculating silence that she found far more terrifying than his outbursts. It was during this period that Schaefer began actively hunting women, using his position as a police officer to gain their trust before unleashing the violence he had been suppressing since childhood. His method was chillingly effective. He would patrol isolated stretches of coastal highway, particularly along State Road A1A in Martin and Broward counties, and stop young women under the pretense of routine traffic stops or minor violations. Wearing his uniform and driving a marked police cruiser, Schaefer presented an image of authority and safety that allowed him to lure his victims without resistance. On July 21, 1972, Schaefer pulled over 2 17-year-old girls, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Sue Wells, who were hitchhiking along A1A near Stuart, Florida. He told them that hitchhiking was illegal and that he would need to take them into custody, but instead of driving to the police station, Schaefer transported them to a remote, wooded area on Hutchinson Island. What followed was a nightmare of terror and degradation. Schaefer tied both girls to trees, stripping them and subjecting them to hours of psychological torment, sexual humiliation, and physical abuse. He alternated between threatening to kill them and promising to let them go, a calculated manipulation designed to maximize their fear and his own sadistic gratification. At one point, Schaefer left the scene, telling the girls he was going to get gasoline to burn them alive. It was a decision that would ultimately save their lives. While he was gone, Nancy Trotter managed to work her hands free from the bindings and untied Pamela Wells. The 2 girls fled through the dense coastal vegetation and flagged down a passing motorist on the nearby highway. They were taken to a hospital and immediately reported what had happened. When Schaefer returned to the woods and found his victims gone, he reportedly panicked. He was still on duty and knew that 2 young women with his description would inevitably lead investigators straight to him. In a move that demonstrated his extraordinary arrogance and miscalculation, Schaefer called his supervisor and reported that he had encountered 2 hitchhikers but had let them go with a warning. Within hours, investigators had connected the girls' report to Schaefer, and he was arrested on July 26, 1972, just 5 days after the abduction. He was charged with aggravated assault, kidnapping, and improper use of a police badge. While Schaefer was out on bail awaiting trial for the abduction of Trotter and Wells, a staggering discovery was made that transformed the case from a single incident of police misconduct into one of the most horrifying serial killer investigations in American history. On September 27, 1972, a surveyor working on Hutchinson Island stumbled upon the skeletal remains of 2 women in a densely overgrown area not far from where Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells had been tied to trees. The remains were identified as those of Colette Goodenough, a 19-year-old woman who had gone missing in January 1972, and Barbara Ann Wilcox, a 17-year-old who had disappeared in February 1972. Both women had been bound, mutilated, and left to die in the remote wilderness. As investigators expanded their search of the area, additional human remains were discovered, eventually leading to the identification of multiple other victims, including Susan Place, a 17-year-old who had vanished in April 1972, and her 15-year-old friend, Georgia Jessup. In total, the remains of at least 8 women and girls were recovered from sites along Florida's Treasure Coast, all bearing signs of extreme violence, torture, and sexual assault. The geographical pattern of the dump sites closely matched the areas where Schaefer had patrolled during his shifts, and forensic evidence, including the type of bindings used and the manner of killings, strongly linked the murders to the man who had already been arrested for kidnapping 2 teenagers. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern that had gone undetected for months. Young women had been disappearing from the coastal communities of Martin and Broward counties at an alarming rate throughout the first half of 1972, but because the victims were largely transient, hitchhiking, or involved in marginal lifestyles, law enforcement had not initially connected the disappearances. Some officers had even dismissed the missing persons reports, assuming the women had simply moved on to other locations. Schaefer had exploited this institutional blind spot with surgical precision, targeting victims he believed society would not immediately miss, and using his position to deflect suspicion when questions arose. Schaefer's trial for the abduction of Nancy Trotter and Pamela Sue Wells began in 1973. The prosecution presented a devastating case, with both girls delivering powerful testimony about their ordeal. The physical evidence, including the ropes and bindings recovered from the scene that matched materials found in Schaefer's home and patrol car, made the case overwhelming. Schaefer took the stand in his own defense, a decision that proved disastrous. He presented himself as a misunderstood figure who had simply taken the girls to the woods to scare them away from the dangers of hitchhiking, a narrative so transparently absurd that jurors visibly recoiled. On April 23, 1973, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Gerard John Schaefer guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for the kidnappings, a sentence that many, including the victims and their families, considered shockingly lenient given the severity of the crimes. However, the abduction conviction was only the beginning. While Schaefer was serving his sentence, prosecutors in Martin County were building a capital murder case against him for the deaths of Colette Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox. In a separate trial, Schaefer was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The evidence in the murder trial included forensic testimony linking the victims' remains to the dump sites near Schaefer's patrol routes, as well as testimony from fellow inmates who reported that Schaefer had confessed to the killings while incarcerated, describing in graphic detail how he had tortured and murdered his victims. Despite the consecutive life sentences, investigators were convinced that Schaefer was responsible for far more deaths than the 2 for which he had been convicted. Over the years that followed his incarceration, Schaefer became a subject of intense fascination for criminologists, journalists, and true crime writers, in large part because of his willingness to correspond with people from his prison cell. Schaefer wrote extensively to various individuals, including authors and researchers, and in his letters he made cryptic references to additional murders, suggesting that the 8 confirmed victims represented only a fraction of his actual body count. Some investigators believe that Schaefer may have killed as many as 30 or more women across Florida and possibly in other states during the years before and during his brief law enforcement career. He was investigated in connection with several unsolved murders and disappearances of young women in Florida, Georgia, and other states, but no additional charges were ever filed, in part because Schaefer deliberately provided just enough information to generate suspicion without offering the kind of specific, verifiable details that prosecutors needed to secure convictions. Schaefer's case exposed catastrophic failures in the systems designed to protect the public from predatory individuals in positions of authority. His ability to use his police uniform and patrol car as tools for hunting victims highlighted the extreme vulnerability of young women who were conditioned to comply with law enforcement commands without question. The case became a landmark example in discussions about police vetting procedures, leading to significant reforms in how background investigations were conducted for law enforcement applicants in Florida and eventually across the country. The question of how a man with Schaefer's documented history of violent and disturbing behavior toward women was able to obtain a badge and a gun became the subject of official reviews and internal affairs investigations that revealed a culture of negligence and willful ignorance within the Wilton Manors Police Department. During his decades in prison, Schaefer continued to be a disruptive and manipulative presence. He filed numerous frivolous lawsuits, maintained a correspondence network that some critics argued amounted to a fan club, and never expressed a single word of remorse for any of his crimes. He maintained his innocence in the murders until the end, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, and continued to blame his victims for their own deaths, a pattern of psychological deflection that mental health professionals who evaluated him described as consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features. Gerard John Schaefer remained incarcerated at the Florida State Prison until December 3, 1995, when he was found dead in his cell at the age of 49. He had been murdered by a fellow inmate, Vincent Rivera, who stabbed him multiple times, reportedly in a confrontation that may have been related to Schaefer's persistent harassment of other inmates and his reputation as a child predator and woman killer. His death was met with little public sympathy. For the families of his victims, Schaefer's death in prison brought a form of closure, though it could never undo the devastation he had caused. Nancy Trotter and Pamela Sue Wells, the two teenagers whose escape led to Schaefer's initial arrest, went on to live quiet lives but carried the psychological scars of their ordeal for decades. The case of Gerard John Schaefer remains one of the most disturbing in the annals of American criminal justice, a stark reminder that the uniform of authority can be weaponized by those whose capacity for evil is exceeded only by their ability to conceal it behind a facade of respectability. Number 2, Drew Peterson, a veteran Illinois police sergeant who murdered his third wife and made his fourth wife vanish, using his decades of law enforcement expertise to cover his tracks and delay justice for years. Drew Walter Peterson was born on January 5, 1954, in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburban community about 30 miles southwest of Chicago. He grew up in a working-class family and displayed an interest in law enforcement from a young age, joining the Bolingbrook Police Department as a patrol officer in 1977 when he was just 23 years old. Over the course of a 29-year career, Peterson rose through the ranks to become a sergeant, earning a reputation among his colleagues as a skilled, aggressive, and highly effective officer. He was known for his street smarts, his physical imposing presence, and his ability to navigate the complexities of criminal investigations. What his colleagues did not know, or chose not to see, was that behind the confident, jovial exterior Peterson presented at work was a deeply controlling, manipulative, and violent man who treated the women in his life as possessions to be dominated and, when necessary, discarded. Peterson was married 4 times, and each marriage followed a disturbingly similar pattern of escalating control, isolation, and abuse. His first marriage, to Carol Brown in 1974, ended in divorce in 1980 after Peterson's controlling behavior became unbearable. His second marriage, to Victoria, produced 2 children but also ended in divorce amid allegations of emotional abuse and infidelity. It was his third marriage, to Kathleen Savio, that would ultimately lead to murder and a case that captivated the nation. Kathleen Savio was a vibrant, outgoing woman who married Peterson in 1992. Their relationship produced 2 sons but deteriorated rapidly as Peterson's controlling tendencies intensified. Savio later told friends and family members that Peterson had become increasingly threatening, warning her that he could kill her and make it look like an accident because he knew exactly how investigations worked. She reported incidents of physical abuse to the Bolingbrook Police Department, but because Peterson was a fellow officer, her complaints were treated with skepticism and minimized by the very department that employed her husband. In 2002, Savio filed for divorce, and the proceedings were acrimonious and hostile. Peterson was furious about the divorce, particularly regarding the division of marital assets and custody arrangements, and witnesses later testified that he made repeated threats against Savio's life during this period. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead in the bathtub of her home in Bolingbrook. She was 40 years old. The initial investigation was handled by the Bolingbrook Police Department, Peterson's own department, a conflict of interest so egregious that it would later become the centerpiece of the case against him. The responding officers, including colleagues and subordinates of Peterson, conducted a cursory examination of the scene and quickly concluded that Savio had died in an accidental drowning. The crime scene was not secured as a potential homicide scene, forensic evidence was not properly collected or preserved, and the autopsy was performed by a local coroner who had no specialized training in forensic pathology. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, and the case was closed within days. No one from the department interviewed Peterson as a suspect, despite the fact that he was the estranged husband with a documented history of threats and abuse toward the victim. Kathleen Savio was buried, and Drew Peterson went on with his life, eventually marrying his fourth wife, Stacy Ann Callis, in 2003 while still legally married to Savio, a detail that underscored the chaotic and overlapping nature of his personal relationships. Stacy Peterson was 20 years younger than Drew when they married, a former hotel clerk who was initially charmed by his confidence and assertiveness but soon found herself trapped in the same cycle of control and fear that had characterized his previous marriages. Friends of Stacy reported that Peterson became increasingly possessive after their marriage, ensuring that he will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. Despite the murder conviction, Stacy Peterson's body has never been found, and Drew Peterson has never been charged in connection with her disappearance, though authorities have publicly stated that they believe she was murdered and that Peterson was responsible. The case exposed devastating flaws in how police departments handle domestic violence allegations against their own officers and how conflicts of interest can compromise even the most basic investigative protocols. The Bolingbrook Police Department's failure to properly investigate Kathleen Savio's death in 2004 allowed a murderer to remain free for years and may have cost Stacy Peterson her life. The Illinois legislature subsequently passed a law, colloquially known as Drew's Law, that expanded the circumstances under which hearsay evidence could be admitted in criminal trials, a direct response to the challenges prosecutors faced in building a case without the testimony of the missing witness. Drew Peterson is currently incarcerated at the Danville Correctional Center in Illinois, where he is serving his consecutive sentences. His case remains a haunting example of how law enforcement expertise, when turned toward criminal purposes, can create almost insurmountable obstacles for investigators and prosecutors, and how the culture of silence and protection within police departments can enable violence against the very people officers are sworn to protect. Number 3, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who spent decades as the elusive Golden State Killer, terrorizing California with a campaign of burglaries, sexual assaults, and murders that remained unsolved for over 40 years until revolutionary genetic technology finally brought him to justice. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, a small town in the Finger Lakes region. His childhood was marked by instability and trauma. DeAngelo's father was an alcoholic who was frequently unemployed and emotionally abusive, and the family moved frequently as his father struggled to hold jobs. When DeAngelo was a young teenager, a deeply disturbing event occurred that witnesses later described as a formative trauma. A young man, possibly DeAngelo himself, witnessed the brutal rape and murder of a young woman in a remote area near his home. The details of this incident remain murky and debated, but those who knew DeAngelo in his youth have suggested that it left a profound psychological mark, potentially igniting the violent sexual predation that would define his adult life. Despite the turmoil of his home environment, DeAngelo was an intelligent child who performed adequately in school. He joined the United States Navy after graduating high school, serving from 1964 to 1968 during the Vietnam War era. He was stationed at the Naval Support Activity Base in Long Beach, California, and it was during this time that he was first exposed to the California communities he would later terrorize. After his honorable discharge from the Navy, D'Angelo attended Sierra College in Rocklin, California, before transferring to California State University, Sacramento, where he earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice in 1972. His choice of major would later be viewed with chilling irony, as the very discipline he studied provided him with detailed knowledge of investigative techniques, forensic science, and the behavioral patterns that law enforcement uses to track criminals. D'Angelo attended the police academy and was hired as a police officer by the Exeter Police Department in the San Joaquin Valley in 1973. He then moved to the Auburn Police Department in the Sacramento suburbs in 1976. By all accounts, D'Angelo was a competent and unremarkable police officer. He was not particularly well liked by his colleagues, who described him as tense, irritable, and socially awkward, but he performed his duties adequately and did not draw negative attention. What no one knew was that during this same period, D'Angelo was launching one of the most extensive and brutal criminal campaigns in American history. The crime spree that would eventually be attributed to D'Angelo began around June 1976 in the Sacramento area, where a series of home invasion burglaries shocked suburban communities. The perpetrator, initially dubbed the Visalia Ransacker, would break into homes at night, often targeting single women or couples, and ransack the interiors, taking small items of personal significance rather than valuables. The burglaries escalated rapidly in severity, with the intruder beginning to assault residents, particularly women, during the break-ins. In December 1975, a shooting in Visalia linked to the ransacking pattern targeted a journalist who had been investigating the break-ins, though the victim survived. By mid-1976, the attacks in the Sacramento area had escalated to sexual assaults of terrifying brutality. The perpetrator would enter homes in the early morning hours, often after meticulous surveillance of the victims' routines, and awaken them at gunpoint or knife point. He would blindfold the victims, tie them up with ligatures he brought to the scene, and then sexually assault the female victims over periods that sometimes lasted hours. The level of planning, control, and psychological manipulation demonstrated by the attacker was unprecedented, and he displayed an intimate knowledge of police procedures, avoiding leaving fingerprints, wearing masks, and using techniques to minimize evidence. Sacramento law enforcement dubbed the unknown assailant the East Area Rapist, and the investigation became one of the largest in the region's history. Task forces were formed, hundreds of officers were assigned, and residents lived in a state of pervasive fear, installing additional locks, purchasing weapons, and organizing neighborhood watch programs. Despite the massive law enforcement response, the East Area Rapist continued his attacks with impunity, striking at least 50 times in the Sacramento area between 1976 and 1978. In 1978, the attacks abruptly stopped in Sacramento and resumed in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically in Contra Costa County, where a similar pattern of home invasion sexual assaults began occurring. The attacker then moved to Santa Barbara County and Orange County in Southern California. Along with this geographical escalation came an escalation in violence. In October 1979, the perpetrator committed his first murder, killing a couple in their home in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. Over the next 2 years, he murdered at least 12 more people across California, attacking couples in their homes, often in secluded suburban neighborhoods, using methods that were consistent with his earlier assault pattern but now ending with the execution of the victims. The connection between the East Area Rapist and the Southern California murders was not immediately recognized by law enforcement, as different jurisdictions handled their own investigations with limited information sharing. It was not until the early 1980s that forensic analysts connected the cases through DNA evidence recovered from crime scenes, establishing that a single individual was responsible for the burglaries, rapes, and murders spanning the entire state. This composite offender was given a new name, the Golden State Killer, though he was also known as the original Night Stalker to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, who would later terrorize Southern California under a similar moniker. The investigation into the Golden State Killer became one of the longest and most frustrating in California history. Thousands of suspects were investigated and eliminated over the decades. Joseph D'Angelo himself was briefly considered as a suspect in the Exeter area during the Visalia ransacker phase, as he bore a general physical resemblance to composite sketches, but he was apparently eliminated from consideration, possibly because his alibi as a police officer was accepted at face value. In 1979, D'Angelo was fired from the Auburn Police Department after he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a hardware store, a seemingly minor incident that abruptly ended his law enforcement career. The reasons for the theft were never clearly explained, but some investigators later speculated that the dog repellent might have been intended for use in his attacks, as some victims reported that their attacker used a chemical spray to disorient them. After his dismissal from the police department, D'Angelo worked in various blue-collar jobs, including at a distribution center for Save Mart supermarkets, where he remained employed for nearly 25 years until his arrest. He married in 1973 and fathered 3 daughters, and by all external appearances, he lived a quiet, unremarkable life in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights. Neighbors described him as a normal, if somewhat reclusive, older man who kept to himself, mowed his lawn, and attended his daughter's school events. The monstrous double life he led remained completely hidden for decades. The breakthrough in the case came in 2018, through the revolutionary application of forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had never before been used to solve a serial murder case. Investigators, led by Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert and her team, took crime scene DNA from the Golden State Killer cases and uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GMatch, which allows users to search for relatives based on shared DNA segments. The search returned matches to distant relatives of the suspect. And by using genealogical research methods to build family trees forward in time from those distant matches, investigators were able to narrow the pool of potential suspects to a small number of individuals. Through painstaking research that combined genetic data with traditional investigative methods including age, location, physical characteristics, and criminal history, investigators zeroed in on Joseph James D'Angelo as the most likely suspect. They then conducted surveillance of D'Angelo, collecting a discarded DNA sample from his car door handle or a trash can, which was submitted for direct comparison to the crime scene DNA. The match was conclusive. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights by a team of investigators who had been building the case for months. He was 72 years old. When officers confronted him, D'Angelo reportedly said nothing, displaying the same cold, controlled demeanor that had characterized his attacks 40 years earlier. The arrest of the Golden State Killer sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the general public, not only because it solved one of the most notorious cold case series in history but because it revealed that the perpetrator had been a police officer, a fact that had never been definitively established during the original investigation, despite his brief consideration as a suspect decades earlier. D'Angelo's background as a police officer explained many of the features of the crime series that had baffled investigators for years, including his ability to evade detection during neighborhood sweeps, his knowledge of police radio frequencies and response protocols, his avoidance of fingerprint evidence, and his apparent ability to blend seamlessly into suburban environments. On June 29, 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping in a Sacramento courtroom. Under the terms of the plea agreement, he avoided the death penalty and was instead sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The plea hearing included a remarkable and deeply unsettling moment when D'Angelo, for the first time, addressed the court and the families of his victims. Standing in handcuffs and a jail uniform, the 74-year-old muttered a brief statement in which he admitted to the crimes and said he had lived a double life, attributing his actions to an internal force he could not control. Many victims and their families found the statement inadequate and insincere, noting that it came only after he had exhausted every legal avenue to avoid accountability. The D'Angelo case revolutionized criminal investigations worldwide by demonstrating the power of forensic genetic genealogy as an investigative tool. In the years since his arrest, the technique has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States and internationally, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The case also forced a reckoning within law enforcement about the uncomfortable reality that some of the most dangerous predators in society have worn badges, and that the skills and knowledge imparted by police training can be grotesquely perverted to facilitate rather than prevent crime. Joseph James D'Angelo is currently incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, a prison that houses elderly and medically fragile inmates. He will die in prison, his name forever synonymous with one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history and the groundbreaking technology that finally ended it. Number 4, Antoinette Frank, a New Orleans police officer who committed a triple murder during a robbery at a restaurant where she worked off-duty, becoming the first female police officer in the city's history to be convicted of murder. Antoinette Frank was born in 1971 and grew up in the violence-plagued neighborhoods of New Orleans, a city whose culture of corruption within its police department had been well documented for generations. Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, at a time when the department was under intense federal scrutiny for widespread corruption, brutality, and criminal activity among its officers. She was assigned to patrol the 7th District, one of the most dangerous and crime-ridden areas of the city, and by most accounts she performed her duties adequately during her first years on the force. However, behind the uniform, Frank was leading a secret life that was fundamentally at odds with her sworn duty to protect and serve. In early 1995, Frank began working off-duty security shifts at the Kim On restaurant, a family-owned Vietnamese establishment in the eastern New Orleans neighborhood of New Orleans East. The restaurant was a popular local spot, and its owners, Quang Vu and his wife Ha, had invested years of work into building the business. Frank's presence as an off-duty officer was intended to provide a sense of security for the restaurant and its patrons, a common arrangement in New Orleans where businesses frequently hired off-duty police for supplemental security. What the Vu family did not know was that Antoinette Frank was using her position to plan a robbery of the very establishment she was hired to protect. Frank recruited 2 accomplices, including a man named Rogers Lacaze, a 17-year-old with a criminal history whom Frank had met through her police work. The plan was simple in conception but staggering in its audacity. Frank would use her position as a uniformed officer to gain access to the restaurant, control the occupants, and facilitate the robbery, while Lacaze would serve as the armed enforcer. The scheme exploited the fundamental trust that the public places in law enforcement, a trust that Frank was about to betray in the most violent possible way. On March 4, 1995, at approximately 11 o'clock at night, Frank and Lacaze entered the Kim On restaurant. The restaurant was preparing to close, and only a few employees and family members remained inside. Frank, wearing her police uniform and carrying her service weapon, positioned herself as the security presence, while Lacaze, wearing a ski mask and armed with a handgun, initiated the robbery. What happened next was a scene of calculated carnage. Lacaze confronted the employees at gunpoint, demanding money from the register and the safe. As the robbery unfolded, Frank drew her own weapon and turned it on the very people she had been hired to protect. Quang Vu, the owner, was shot and killed by Lacaze during a struggle. Ha Vu, Quang's wife, was also shot and critically wounded. But the most devastating moment came when Frank turned her gun on Officer Ronald Williams II, a fellow New Orleans police officer who was also working off-duty security at the restaurant that night. Williams, who was in a back room and apparently unaware of the robbery until it was already in progress, was confronted by Frank. In a moment of incomprehensible betrayal, Frank shot and killed Williams, her own colleague, firing the fatal shots that ended his life. The murder of Ronald Williams was not a case of mistaken identity or collateral damage. Williams was a police officer who would have been a witness to the robbery and could have identified Frank as a participant. His death was a deliberate, cold-blooded execution designed to eliminate a potential witness and further the cover-up. After the shooting, Frank and Lacaze fled the restaurant with an undisclosed amount of cash. Ha Vu, despite her critical injuries, survived the attack and was able to provide crucial information to investigators when they arrived at the scene. The investigation into the triple murder at the Kim On restaurant moved with unusual speed, driven by the outrage and urgency that accompanies the killing of a police officer. The New Orleans Police Department, despite its well-documented problems with internal corruption, could not ignore the murder of one of its own. Initial efforts to attribute the crime to an external robbery were quickly undermined by evidence that pointed to an inside job. Investigators recovered Frank's police badge and identification at the scene, items that suggested her presence was not merely coincidental. Ballistic evidence linked the bullets that killed Officer Williams to Frank's service weapon. Witnesses and surviving victims provided accounts that placed Frank as an active participant in the robbery rather than a victim or a bystander. Frank was arrested on March 5, 1995, just hours after the murders, when she arrived at the police station ostensibly to provide a statement about the incident. Her story, that she had arrived at the restaurant after the shooting and had exchanged gunfire with the robbers, quickly fell apart under scrutiny. The physical evidence, including the location of shell casings, the trajectory of bullets, and the absence of any evidence that Frank had fired at Lacaze or been fired upon by him, completely contradicted her account. Rogers Lacaze was arrested separately and ultimately cooperated with investigators to some degree, though the exact nature and extent of his cooperation remained a matter of dispute throughout the legal proceedings. The trial of Antoinette Frank began in October 1995, just 7 months after the murders, an extraordinarily rapid timeline for a capital murder case. The prosecution presented a devastating case that portrayed Frank as the architect of the robbery-murder scheme. Key evidence included the ballistic analysis linking her weapon to Williams' death, testimony from Havu identifying Frank as one of the shooters, and the testimony of other witnesses who placed Frank at the scene in a role consistent with participation rather than resistance. The prosecution argued that Frank had exploited her position as a police officer to gain the trust of the victims, had planned the robbery in advance, had recruited an accomplice, and had executed her fellow officer to eliminate a witness. The defense attempted to shift the blame primarily onto Lacaze, arguing that Frank had been present at the restaurant but had not participated in the robbery or the killings. The defense suggested that Lacaze had acted alone and that Frank had been caught in the crossfire. This narrative was deeply undermined by the physical evidence and the witness testimony, and jurors found it wholly unconvincing. On October 20, 1995, the jury found Antoinette Frank guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The same jury subsequently recommended the death penalty, and the judge formally sentenced Frank to death by lethal injection. Rogers Lacaze was separately tried, convicted of first-degree murder, and also sentenced to death. The Frank case sent shockwaves through the New Orleans Police Department and the city at large. The idea that a police officer had planned and executed a robbery that included the murder of her own colleague was almost beyond comprehension, even in a city accustomed to police corruption. The case became a symbol of the deep-seated institutional rot within the NOPD, contributing to the momentum for federal intervention that would eventually lead to a Department of Justice consent decree mandating sweeping reforms within the department. Antoinette Frank's conviction and death sentence were upheld on appeal, and she remains on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, Louisiana. Rogers Lacaze also remained on death row until his death from cancer in 2018. The Kim On restaurant, the scene of the horror, never reopened. The Vu family, having lost Kwong and having survived an ordeal of unimaginable violence, closed the business and left New Orleans. The family of Ronald Williams II was left to grapple with the knowledge that their son and brother was not killed by a criminal outsider but by a fellow officer, a woman who had taken the same oath he had, who had worn the same uniform, and who had used that uniform as a weapon against him. The case of Antoinette Frank remains one of the most stark and disturbing examples of police criminality in American history, a reminder that the capacity for evil exists in every institution and that no badge, no matter how solemnly bestowed, is proof of character. Number 5, Jared S. Rentschler, a Minnesota police officer who murdered his estranged girlfriend and her mother in their home, a case that laid bare the devastating intersection of domestic violence, law enforcement culture, and the failure of systems designed to protect the vulnerable. Jared Rentschler was born in the late 1980s and grew up in Minnesota, where he developed an interest in law enforcement that led him to pursue a career as a police officer. He was hired by the Cottage Grove Police Department, a suburban community southeast of the Twin Cities, and by most accounts was regarded as a capable and professional officer during his time on the force. Rentschler's personal life, however, was a cauldron of dysfunction and escalating danger. He became involved in a romantic relationship with a woman named Madison Schemmel, and the relationship, like many abusive partnerships, did not begin with violence but gradually devolved into a pattern of control, jealousy, and intimidation. Friends and family members of Madison later described how Rentschler had initially seemed attentive and caring but had slowly isolated her from her support network, monitored her communications, and became increasingly possessive. As the relationship deteriorated, Madison made the decision to end it, a choice that, as domestic violence experts consistently note, is often the most dangerous moment for a victim of intimate partner violence. Rentschler did not accept the breakup. His behavior in the weeks and months following the separation escalated from emotional harassment to overt threats, a trajectory that is tragically common in domestic violence cases but that takes on an additional dimension of danger when the perpetrator is a trained, armed law enforcement officer. Madison and her family were aware of the threat Rentschler posed and took steps to protect themselves. They communicated their fears to friends and, significantly, to law enforcement. The fact that the person they feared was himself a police officer created a paradox of vulnerability. Madison and her family knew that Rentschler had access to weapons, had training in tactics and surveillance, and had the professional knowledge to potentially circumvent the legal protections they might seek, such as restraining orders. They also knew, implicitly or explicitly, that the law enforcement system they might turn to for protection was the same system that employed and vouched for the man who threatened them. On December 31, 2019, New Year's Eve, Jared Rentschler went to the home of Madison Schemmel's mother, Sherry Baker, in Cottage Grove. What precise sequence of events led to Rentschler's arrival at the home that night remains partially unclear, but the outcome was catastrophic. Rentschler entered the home and shot and killed both Madison Schemmel and Sherry Baker. The murders were not the result of a spontaneous confrontation that escalated out of control. The evidence indicated that Rentschler went to the home with the intent to kill, carrying out a premeditated act of violence against two women who had tried to extract themselves from his control. After the murders, Rentschler did not flee the scene or attempt to create an elaborate alibi. Instead, he called 911 himself and reported that there had been a shooting at the residence. When officers arrived, they found the bodies of Madison Schemmel and Sherry Baker and encountered Rentschler at the scene. He was taken into custody without incident. The fact that Rentschler, a police officer, called 911 after committing a double murder was interpreted by prosecutors and investigators as evidence not of remorse or confusion but of the calculated, controlled nature of the act. He knew that calling 911 would allow him to control the initial narrative of the event, a tactic that law enforcement officers who commit crimes are uniquely positioned to employ. The investigation into the murders was handled by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, Minnesota's statewide investigative agency, rather than the Cottage Grove Police Department, a necessary and standard protocol when a local officer is involved in a serious crime. The BCA investigation uncovered a substantial body of evidence documenting the history of Rentschler's abusive behavior toward Madison, including text messages, witness statements from friends and family, and records of prior contacts with law enforcement related to the turbulent relationship. The investigation also examined Rentschler's use of police databases and resources, raising questions about whether he had used his law enforcement access to track or monitor Madison in the period leading up to the murders. The trial of Jared Rentschler took place in Washington County, Minnesota, in 2021. The prosecution presented a case that was as much about the pattern of domestic abuse leading up to the murders as it was about the murders themselves. Prosecutors argued that Rentschler had systematically terrorized Madison Schemmel in the months before the killings, using his position as a police officer to intimidate her and her family, and that the murders were the culmination of a campaign of control that ended in lethal violence when Madison refused to submit to his authority any longer. The defense attempted to characterize the killings as the result of a mental health crisis or an emotional breakdown, seeking a conviction on lesser charges that would carry a shorter sentence. The jury rejected this narrative. After deliberating, the jury found Jared Rentschler guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, a verdict that reflected their determination that the killings were premeditated and intentional. The judge sentenced Rentschler to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he will never be released. The case of Jared Rentschler resonated far beyond the community of Cottage Grove because it illuminated a problem that domestic violence advocates have been highlighting for years, namely the heightened danger faced by women who are in relationships with law enforcement officers. Studies have consistently shown that police officers commit domestic violence at rates at least as high as, and possibly higher than, the general population, and that the specific dynamics of officer-involved domestic violence make it particularly difficult for victims to seek help and escape. Officers who abuse their partners have access to weapons, they understand the legal system well enough to exploit its weaknesses, they often have the loyalty of their colleagues, and they can use the threat of their authority to silence victims who might otherwise report the abuse. In the aftermath of the murders, the Cottage Grove Police Department conducted an internal review to determine whether any warning signs of Rentschler's violent potential had been missed during his employment. The department, like many law enforcement agencies, had no formal mechanism in place for monitoring the personal relationships of its officers or for intervening when officers showed signs of problematic behavior in their private lives. This institutional blind spot is not unique to Cottage Grove but reflects a broader systemic failure in American law enforcement, where the boundary between an officer's professional conduct and their personal behavior is often treated as impermeable even when evidence suggests otherwise. The families of Madison Schemmel and Sherry Baker were left to navigate the aftermath of an incomprehensible loss. Madison was a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, and Sherry was a mother who had opened her home to protect her daughter from the very danger that ultimately claimed them both. Their deaths underscored the terrifying reality that for some victims of domestic violence, the systems designed to provide protection can be inadequate, compromised, or even weaponized by the perpetrators themselves. Jared Rentschler is currently serving his consecutive life sentences at a Minnesota correctional facility, his name added to the grim roster of law enforcement officers who used their training, their authority, and their access to lethal force not to protect the public but to destroy the people closest to them. Number 6, Ron J. Eddings, a Sacramento police officer who used his badge, his weapon, and the inherent authority of his position to sexually assault multiple women over a period of more than a decade, exploiting the power imbalance between law enforcement and the public in the most intimate and degrading way possible. Ronald Eddings joined the Sacramento Police Department in the early 2000s, and during his tenure he worked primarily as a patrol officer in some of the city's most vulnerable neighborhoods, areas with high rates of poverty, homelessness, and sex work. Eddings was not a decorated officer or a high-profile member of the department. He was, by most accounts, an average patrolman who did his job without distinction. But beneath the surface of this unremarkable professional exterior, Eddings was systematically sexually assaulting women, using his uniform and his authority to coerce compliance from victims who had little reason to believe they would be believed if they reported the abuse. The pattern of Eddings' predatory behavior was consistent across multiple incidents and spanned from approximately 2006 to 2018. Eddings would encounter women, often in vulnerable circumstances, during the course of his patrols. Some of his victims were sex workers, others were women experiencing homelessness or substance abuse issues, and others were simply women going about their lives in neighborhoods where police presence was heavy. Eddings would use the pretense of a legitimate law enforcement contact, such as a traffic stop, a pedestrian contact, or an investigation of suspicious activity, to isolate the women. Once they were separated from potential witnesses, Eddings would use his authority to compel them into sexual acts, implying or explicitly stating that they would face arrest, incarceration, or other consequences if they refused. This method of predation, sometimes referred to as badge grooming or authority exploitation, is one of the most insidious forms of police misconduct because it leverages the immense power imbalance between an armed officer and a civilian in a way that makes resistance seem not just difficult but life-threatening. The women Eddings assaulted were not chosen at random. He selected victims who he believed were unlikely to report the attacks, women whose credibility would be questioned, whose lifestyles would be used to undermine their testimony, and who had the least access to the institutional resources that might support a complaint. This calculated victim selection is a hallmark of authority-based sexual predation and reflects a deep understanding, whether conscious or intuitive, of the systemic biases within the criminal justice system that disadvantage certain populations when they attempt to hold officers accountable. For years, Eddings' victims suffered in silence. Some may not have fully understood that what was happening to them was a crime, so complete was the manipulation of authority that blurred the line between coercion and consent. Others knew it was wrong but were terrified of the consequences of reporting a police officer. Some likely did attempt to report the abuse, only to have their complaints dismissed, minimized, or ignored by a system that was predisposed to believe an officer over a civilian, particularly a civilian from a marginalized background. The silence that surrounded Eddings' crimes was not simply the result of individual fear but of institutional structures that make it extraordinarily difficult for victims of police sexual misconduct to come forward and be taken seriously. The beginning of the end for Ron Eddings came not through a single dramatic revelation but through a gradual accumulation of reports and complaints that eventually reached a threshold that the Sacramento Police Department could no longer ignore or dismiss. By 2018, multiple women had come forward independently with strikingly similar accounts of being sexually assaulted by a Sacramento police officer during traffic stops or other contacts. The similarities in the accounts, including the methods used to isolate victims, the language used to coerce compliance, and the physical descriptions of the officer, made it clear that a single perpetrator was responsible for a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. The Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, working in conjunction with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office, launched a formal criminal investigation. Detectives identified Ron Eddings as the suspect and began the painstaking process of locating and interviewing potential victims, many of whom had to be found through outreach efforts in shelters, rehabilitation centers, and community organizations. The investigation ultimately identified multiple victims spanning the 12-year period from 2006 to 2018, though investigators acknowledged that the actual number of victims was likely higher, as many women who had been assaulted by Eddings may never have come forward. The evidence in the case included victim testimony that was remarkably consistent in its description of Eddings' methods, as well as circumstantial evidence including patrol records, dispatch logs, and GPS data from Eddings' patrol car that placed him at the locations and times described by victims. In some cases, victims had preserved physical evidence or had confided in friends or family members at the time of the assaults, providing corroboration that strengthened the overall case. Ron Eddings was arrested in 2019 and charged with multiple felony counts, including sexual battery, assault under color of authority, and kidnapping. The charges reflected the gravity of the abuse and the specific legal framework that applies when a law enforcement officer uses the authority of their position to commit crimes. The concept of assault under color of authority is a particularly important legal distinction because it recognizes that the power dynamic inherent in a police-civilian encounter fundamentally changes the nature of the crime. A sexual assault committed by a police officer who uses the threat of arrest or the authority of their badge to compel submission is not equivalent to a sexual assault committed by a civilian, because the officer is weaponizing the public trust and the legal authority vested in their position. The trial of Ron Eddings took place in Sacramento County Superior Court in 2021. The prosecution presented the testimony of multiple victims, each of whom described experiences that followed the same chilling template of isolation, coercion, and sexual violation. The cumulative impact of hearing one victim after another describe the same methodical predation was devastating, and the prosecution argued that the pattern demonstrated not impulsive behavior but a deliberate, sustained campaign of sexual exploitation that was made possible only by Eddings' position as a police officer. The defense attempted to challenge the credibility of individual victims, a standard strategy in cases involving allegations of sexual assault, but the sheer number of victims and the consistency of their accounts made this approach largely ineffective. The defense also suggested that some of the encounters had been consensual, an argument that the prosecution systematically dismantled by demonstrating the power dynamics that rendered genuine consent impossible in the context of a police-civilian encounter where the officer holds the unilateral power to arrest, detain, or otherwise destroy the life of the person they are coercing. On September 2, 2021, the jury found Ron Eddings guilty on multiple felony counts. The verdict was a watershed moment for the victims, many of whom had carried the weight of their abuse for years without any acknowledgement that what had happened to them was a crime. The judge sentenced Eddings to 14 years in state prison, a sentence that some advocates felt was inadequate given the number of victims and the duration of the abuse, but that nevertheless represented a meaningful accountability for crimes that are notoriously difficult to prosecute. The Eddings case forced a reckoning within the Sacramento Police Department regarding its handling of complaints against officers, particularly complaints involving sexual misconduct. The department implemented new protocols for tracking and investigating complaints of officer-involved sexual abuse, including requirements that such complaints be flagged for immediate review by supervisory personnel and that investigators receive specialized training in trauma-informed interviewing techniques for victims of authority-based sexual assault. The case also contributed to a broader national conversation about the prevalence of sexual misconduct by law enforcement officers, a problem that has historically been underreported and underinvestigated. Studies by organizations including the Cato Institute and the National Police Misconduct Reporting Project have estimated that sexual misconduct is the second most commonly reported type of police misconduct after excessive force, and that the actual incidence is likely far higher than reported figures suggest due to the immense barriers to reporting. Ron Eddings is currently serving his sentence in the California prison system. His case stands as a powerful and disturbing illustration of how the authority vested in a police officer can be perverted into a tool of sexual predation, and how the systemic biases that disadvantage certain populations can create virtually consequence-free hunting grounds for predators in uniform. Number 7, Ryan Hoas, a Reading, Pennsylvania police officer who murdered his wife in their home and then attempted to stage the scene to look like a home invasion, a case that revealed the lethal potential of domestic violence when combined with forensic knowledge and the strategic thinking of a trained investigator. Ryan Hoas was a member of the Reading Police Department in Berks County, Pennsylvania, a mid-sized city with a population of approximately 88,000 people. Hoas had been on the force for several years and had developed a reputation as a competent officer who was well regarded by his supervisors and colleagues. He was married to his wife, whose identity has been protected in many public accounts out of respect for her family, and the couple lived together in a home in the city of Reading. By outward appearances, the Hoas marriage was unremarkable, but beneath the surface, the relationship was deteriorating under the weight of Ryan Hoas's controlling behavior and the couple's mounting financial and personal difficulties. Neighbors and acquaintances later reported that the couple had been arguing with increasing frequency in the weeks and months before the murder, though no one reported witnessing physical violence. This pattern of hidden escalation is characteristic of many domestic violence cases that end in homicide, where the warning signs are visible only in retrospect and often only to those closest to the victims. On the night of the murder, which occurred in early 2020, Ryan Hoas killed his wife in their home. The specific details of the killing, including the weapon used and the exact manner of death, were established through forensic investigation and presented at trial, but the critical element of the crime was not the act of killing itself but what Hoas did afterward. Recognizing that his position as a police officer meant that he would be an immediate focus of any investigation into his wife's death, Hoas took elaborate steps to stage the crime scene to suggest that the killing had been committed by an intruder who had broken into the home. The staging included creating signs of forced entry, disrupting the contents of the home to simulate a robbery or a struggle, and positioning evidence in ways intended to mislead investigators about the sequence of events. Hoas's knowledge of police investigative procedures, gained through his training and experience as an officer, informed every aspect of the staging. He understood what investigators would look for first, what types of evidence would be prioritized, and how the initial impression of a crime scene could influence the direction of an entire investigation. His attempt to create a false narrative of a home invasion was sophisticated and demonstrated the kind of forensic awareness that most civilian perpetrators would not possess. However, Hoas's plan was fundamentally flawed because it underestimated the capabilities of modern forensic science and the determination of investigators who were not willing to accept the scene at face value, particularly because the victim was the wife of a fellow officer. The investigation was handled by the Berks County Detectives Unit rather than the Reading Police Department, a standard protocol in cases involving potential criminal activity by a local officer. The lead investigators arrived at the scene and immediately noted inconsistencies between the staged elements and the actual physical evidence. The signs of forced entry, for example, did not match the type of damage that would typically be caused by an actual break-in. The pattern of disruption inside the home was inconsistent with a genuine robbery, as items of obvious value were left untouched while other items were moved in ways that suggested deliberate staging rather than hasty searching. Most critically, the forensic evidence at the scene, including blood spatter patterns, the location and position of the victim's body, and other trace evidence, told a story that was fundamentally incompatible with the narrative of a random home invasion. Blood spatter analysis, in particular, was devastating to Hoes's story, as the patterns indicated that the killing had occurred in a manner consistent with an intimate, close-range attack by someone who was already inside the home and familiar with the victim's position and movements, not an attack by a stranger who had forced entry. Additional forensic evidence, including DNA analysis, digital forensics involving the couple's electronic devices, and analysis of Hoes's movements and communications in the hours before and after the murder, further dismantled the staged crime scene narrative. Investigators also interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues of the couple, building a picture of the marital difficulties that provided a clear motive for the killing. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and powerfully supported by evidence. Ryan Hoes had murdered his wife, possibly during an argument or as the culmination of a pattern of controlling behavior, and had then used his training and knowledge to try to create a false narrative that would redirect suspicion away from himself. The trial of Ryan Hoes took place in Berks County Court in 2022. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence in a methodical and compelling manner, walking the jury through each element of the crime scene that contradicted the home invasion narrative and each piece of evidence that pointed directly to Hoes as the perpetrator. The forensic experts who testified were unequivocal in their conclusions, and their testimony left no reasonable doubt that the crime scene had been staged by someone with detailed knowledge of police investigative procedures. The defense attempted to cast doubt on specific elements of the forensic analysis, arguing that the interpretation of blood spatter patterns and other trace evidence was subjective and that alternative explanations existed. However, the defense was unable to offer a coherent alternative theory that accounted for the totality of the evidence, and their arguments were overwhelmed by the cumulative weight of the forensic case against Hoes. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Hoes to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Pennsylvania. The case of Ryan Hoes is significant not only for the tragedy of the murder itself but for what it reveals about the unique challenges that arise when a law enforcement officer commits a crime and attempts to use their professional training to cover it up. Hoes's attempt to stage the crime scene was far more sophisticated than what most perpetrators would attempt, and it was defeated only by the skill and diligence of investigators who had access to the same level of forensic expertise and who were not fooled by the superficial elements of the staging. The case highlights the ongoing arms race between criminal forensic awareness, which has increased dramatically in recent decades due to the proliferation of forensic science in popular media, and the investigative techniques that law enforcement uses to detect deception in staged scenes. For the family and friends of Hoes's wife, the conviction and sentence brought a measure of justice, but it could not undo the betrayal of trust that the murder represented. The victim had shared her life with a man who had sworn to protect others, and that same man had used his skills and knowledge to end her life and try to escape accountability. Ryan Hoes is currently serving his life sentence in the Pennsylvania state prison system, his name a permanent reminder that the training given to police officers to solve crimes can, in the hands of a killer, be turned to the purpose of concealing them. Number 8, Bobby Joe Leonard, a small-town Indiana police officer who raped and murdered a young woman while on duty, a case that exposed the devastating vulnerability of civilians who encounter a predator wearing a badge in isolated communities where accountability is limited and trust is absolute. Bobby Joe Leonard was a part-time police officer in the small town of Odin, Indiana, located in Daviess County in the southern part of the state. Odin is a community of fewer than 1,500 people, a place where everyone knows everyone else and where the local police presence is more symbolic than substantive. Leonard, like many part-time officers in small rural communities, was not a highly trained professional with extensive experience in law enforcement. He was a local man who had been given a badge and a gun with minimal oversight and even less supervision, a situation that is common in rural America where small departments often lack the resources and personnel to maintain the standards of training and accountability found in larger agencies. Leonard had a position of authority in the community by virtue of his badge, but he lacked the character and judgment that such authority demands. On the night of the murder, Leonard encountered a 28-year-old woman, whose name has been protected in many public reports, while he was on patrol. The exact circumstances of the initial encounter remain partially unclear, but what is known is that Leonard used his position as a police officer to separate the woman from any potential witnesses and to bring her under his control. In a small town like Odin, a police officer's authority is virtually absolute, and the idea of refusing a directive from an officer, particularly for a woman alone at night, is socially and practically difficult even in the best of circumstances. Leonard used this inherent power dynamic to isolate his victim, and once she was separated from the community and any means of escape or communication, he raped and murdered her. The killing was brutal and deliberate, and the evidence at the scene indicated that the victim had fought for her life. After the murder, Leonard left the body in a remote location, apparently believing that his position as a police officer would shield him from suspicion or that the small-town environment would prevent a thorough investigation. In this calculation, Leonard was almost correct. The initial response to the woman's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her body was hampered by the limitations of the local police infrastructure. The Odin Police Department, which Leonard himself was part of, had neither the resources nor the expertise to conduct a complex homicide investigation. The department's capacity for forensic evidence collection was minimal, and the initial handling of the crime scene reflected the challenges faced by rural law enforcement agencies when confronted with violent crime. However, the case was eventually taken over by the Indiana State Police, which had the resources and expertise to conduct a proper investigation. State police investigators, working with the Daviess County Prosecutor's Office, methodically built a case against Leonard. The investigation focused on reconstructing Leonard's movements on the night of the murder, examining his patrol records, and interviewing witnesses who might have seen him with the victim. Forensic evidence, including DNA evidence recovered from the victim's body and the crime scene, played a critical role in establishing Leonard's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The DNA evidence was a conclusive link between Leonard and the sexual assault and murder, providing the kind of definitive scientific proof that transcends any questions about witness credibility or circumstantial inference. Bobby Joe Leonard was arrested and charged with murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The case sent shockwaves through the Odin community and the surrounding area, as residents struggled to reconcile the horrific nature of the crimes with the fact that they had been committed by someone who had worn the uniform of local law enforcement. The trial took place in Daviess County Circuit Court in 2016. The prosecution presented a case that was built on the foundation of the DNA evidence but that also included testimony about Leonard's behavior before and after the murder, including evidence that he had attempted to cover his tracks by providing false or misleading information about his whereabouts on the night in question. The prosecution argued that Leonard had used his badge and his patrol vehicle to gain access to the victim and that he had exploited the trust that the community placed in its police officers to commit crimes of unimaginable brutality. The defense attempted to challenge the handling of the DNA evidence and to suggest alternative explanations, but the scientific evidence was overwhelming and left no room for reasonable doubt. The jury convicted Bobby Joe Leonard on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 85 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for accountability. The Leonard case is a stark illustration of a problem that receives far less attention than it deserves: the vulnerability of rural communities to police misconduct and criminality. In small towns across America, part-time and volunteer police officers are entrusted with extraordinary power, including the authority to stop, detain, and use force against civilians, often with minimal training, inadequate supervision, and virtually no ongoing oversight. These officers patrol isolated roads and interact with vulnerable populations in environments where there are few, if any, witnesses to their actions. The combination of unchecked authority, limited supervision, and geographic isolation creates conditions that are ripe for abuse, and when that abuse escalates to the level of violent crime, as it did in Bobby Joe Leonard's case, the consequences are devastating. The case also raised questions about the adequacy of background checks and vetting procedures for part-time officers in small departments. Leonard's background, which included personal and behavioral issues that might have been red flags in a more rigorous screening process, had not been thoroughly examined before he was given a badge and a gun. The failure to properly vet Leonard was not an isolated incident but reflected a systemic problem in rural law enforcement, where the demand for officers often outstrips the supply of qualified candidates and the resources available for thorough background investigations. Bobby Joe Leonard is currently incarcerated in the Indiana State Prison System, where he will spend the rest of his life, barring unforeseen legal developments. For the family of his victim, the conviction brought a form of justice that they had feared might be denied in a small town where the perpetrator was one of the community's own police officers. Their persistence in demanding accountability, even in the face of institutional resistance and limited resources, was a testament to the resilience of survivors of violence and the importance of refusing to accept the silence that often surrounds crimes committed by those in positions of authority. Number 9, Manuel P. Ramos, a Fullerton, California police officer whose excessive use of force resulted in the death of an unarmed, mentally ill man, a case that became a defining moment in the national conversation about police brutality, accountability, and the treatment of people experiencing mental health crises. Manuel Ramos was born in 1972 and joined the Fullerton Police Department in Orange County, California, in the late 1990s. Fullerton is a city of approximately 140,000 people, and its police department handles a full range of law enforcement responsibilities in a community that includes a significant homeless population and individuals with untreated mental illness, a population that is disproportionately affected by police violence. Ramos was a veteran officer at the time of the incident that would define his career and his life, a man who had spent over a decade on the force and who had a record that included both commendations and prior complaints of excessive force. The incident that led to Ramos's prosecution occurred on July 5, 2011, when Fullerton police received reports of a man behaving erratically in the parking lot of the Fullerton Transportation Center, a regional bus and train hub. The man was Kelly Thomas, a 37-year-old homeless man with a long history of schizophrenia and substance abuse. Thomas was well known to local police and to the community's homeless outreach workers, having been the subject of numerous prior contacts with law enforcement, none of which had resulted in serious violence. Thomas was not armed on the night of July 5, and his behavior, while disturbed and disorganized, did not pose an immediate threat of death or serious bodily harm to anyone. Manuel Ramos was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene, along with Officer J. Cicinelli and several other Fullerton police personnel. What began as an attempt to detain and search Thomas for possible theft of items from vehicles in the parking lot escalated within minutes into a prolonged and brutal physical assault that ended with Thomas suffering fatal injuries. The entire encounter was captured on audio by a surveillance camera at the transportation center, and while the camera did not record video of the actual struggle, the audio provided a harrowing and detailed record of the sounds of the encounter, including Thomas's screams, pleas for help, and the officer's commands and exchanges. The audio recording became the most critical piece of evidence in the case, providing an unfiltered account of the encounter that contradicted the officer's written reports and public statements. The audio captured Manuel Ramos putting on latex gloves and saying to Thomas, in a tone that was later characterized by prosecutors as threatening and menacing, that these gloves were going to eat your face or hurt, a statement that was interpreted as an implicit threat of violence before any physical force had been used. When Thomas attempted to stand up and move away from the officers, a physical struggle ensued. Multiple officers, including Ramos and Cicinelli, used force to subdue Thomas, including baton strikes, knee strikes, taser deployments, and physical restraint. During the struggle, Thomas could be heard on the audio crying out in pain and repeatedly calling for his father, saying, "Dad, Dad, they're killing me." The assault continued for several minutes, during which Thomas was subjected to severe blunt force trauma that caused catastrophic injuries. He was transported to a local hospital in a coma and died 5 days later on July 10, 2011, never having regained consciousness. The official cause of death was determined by the coroner to be mechanical asphyxia and blunt force trauma to the head and chest, findings that indicated that Thomas had been essentially crushed and suffocated by the weight and force of the officers who were restraining him. The death of Kelly Thomas ignited a firestorm of controversy and protest in Fullerton and throughout Orange County. The release of the audio recording, which was obtained and published by the Orange County Register, brought the reality of the encounter into the homes and earphones of hundreds of thousands of people, and the public reaction was one of horror, outrage, and disbelief. The sounds of a mentally ill, unarmed man crying for his father while being beaten to death by police officers were almost impossible to reconcile with any conception of legitimate law enforcement. Protests erupted outside the Fullerton Police Department, and the demands for accountability grew so intense that they ultimately led to the recall of 3 city council members who were perceived as insufficiently responsive to the crisis. The Orange County District Attorney's Office, under the leadership of District Attorney Tony Rackauckas, conducted a criminal investigation that ultimately resulted in charges against both Manuel Ramos and Jay Cicinelli. Ramos was charged with second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter, while Cicinelli was charged with involuntary manslaughter and excessive force. The decision to charge Ramos with murder was significant because it represented a rare instance of a police officer being charged with murder, as opposed to lesser charges, for an on-duty use of force. The prosecution argued that Ramos had acted with implied malice, a legal standard for second-degree murder that requires a showing that the defendant acted with a reckless disregard for human life, and that his threat to Thomas before the physical struggle began demonstrated a conscious intent to inflict harm. The trial of Manuel Ramos began in late 2013 in Santa Ana, California. The prosecution presented the audio recording as the centerpiece of its case, arguing that the sounds of the encounter provided irrefutable evidence that the force used against Thomas was excessive, unnecessary, and ultimately fatal. Medical experts testified about the nature and extent of Thomas's injuries, and use of force experts testified that the officer's actions were not consistent with accepted police practices and that Thomas had not posed a threat that justified the level of force used. The defense argued that the officers had acted within the scope of their training and authority, that Thomas had resisted arrest, and that his death was a tragic but unintended consequence of a legitimate use of force against a combative suspect. The defense also challenged the reliability of the audio recording and suggested that it did not provide a complete picture of the encounter because it lacked a visual component. On January 13, 2014, the jury acquitted Manuel Ramos of the murder charge and also acquitted him of the involuntary manslaughter charge. Jay Cicinelli was likewise acquitted on all charges. The verdicts were met with stunned disbelief by Thomas's family, by the community, and by observers across the country who had followed the case closely. The acquittals highlighted the immense difficulty of securing criminal convictions against police officers for on-duty use of force, even in cases where the evidence of excessive force appears overwhelming to a lay audience. Legal analysts attributed the acquittals to several factors, including the high standard of proof required in criminal cases, the inherent deference that jurors often show to police testimony, the effectiveness of the defense's argument that the officers were following their training, and the prosecution's decision to bring the case in a county where the jury pool was likely to include a significant number of residents who were sympathetic to law enforcement. The judge sentenced Ramos to 2.5 years in jail on a lesser-related charge, and he served less than 1 year before being released. The case of Manuel Ramos and Kelly Thomas became a landmark in the national debate about police violence, particularly regarding the treatment of people with mental illness by law enforcement. Thomas's death was one of the early cases that helped catalyze the movement against police brutality that would gain national momentum in the years that followed. It led to significant reforms in Fullerton, including changes to police training protocols regarding encounters with mentally ill individuals, the implementation of crisis intervention team programs, and increased oversight of use of force incidents. The case also underscored the inadequacy of relying on the criminal justice system as the primary mechanism for holding police officers accountable for excessive force, as the Ramos acquittals demonstrated that even the most damning evidence may not be sufficient to overcome the structural advantages that police defendants enjoy in criminal trials. Kelly Thomas's father, Ron Thomas, became a prominent advocate for police reform and for the rights of people with mental illness, speaking at events across the country and working to ensure that his son's death was not forgotten. Manuel Ramos's career in law enforcement was destroyed by the case, and though he avoided a murder conviction, his name became permanently associated with one of the most controversial police brutality cases in California history. Number 10, Thomas A. Lane, a Jefferson County, Alabama sheriff's deputy who murdered his wife in their home during a domestic dispute, a case that once again demonstrated the lethal intersection of domestic violence and law enforcement, and the devastating consequences when the systems designed to prevent intimate partner violence failed to recognize the danger posed by an officer within their own ranks. Thomas Lane was a deputy with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, one of the largest law enforcement agencies in Alabama, serving the county that includes the city of Birmingham. Lane had been a member of the department for several years and was considered a reliable and competent deputy by his supervisors. He was married, and the couple lived together in a home in Jefferson County. The marriage, like many that end in domestic violence homicide, had a history of conflict that was not always visible to those outside the relationship. Friends and family members later described a relationship marked by arguments, jealousy, and controlling behavior on Lane's part, but the full extent of the danger was apparently not recognized until it was too late. The specific details of the Lane marriage's deterioration are private in many respects, but the trajectory from a troubled relationship to lethal violence followed a pattern that domestic violence experts have documented extensively. The risk of homicide in intimate partner relationships increases dramatically when certain factors are present, including access to firearms, a history of controlling or possessive behavior, a recent separation or the threat of separation, and the perpetrator's employment in a position of authority that provides both weapons and a sense of impunity. Thomas Lane possessed every one of these risk factors. As a sheriff's deputy, he had access to firearms and was trained in their use. He had exhibited controlling behavior toward his wife. The couple's relationship was strained to the breaking point, with discussions of separation apparently taking place. And Lane's position as a law enforcement officer gave him a degree of social authority and institutional protection that may have contributed to his belief that he could act without consequences. On the night of the murder in 2015, Thomas Lane and his wife were involved in a domestic dispute at their home. The exact nature and content of the dispute remain known primarily to the participants, but the outcome was definitive and irreversible. During the course of the argument, Lane shot and killed his wife. The use of a firearm in a domestic dispute by a law enforcement officer is a particularly horrifying phenomenon because it represents the conversion of a tool of public safety into an instrument of private terror. Lane did not use his service weapon in the killing, but his access to firearms and his familiarity with their use as a core component of his professional identity made the act of shooting his wife a reflection of the intersection of his personal violence and his professional training. After the shooting, Lane did not flee the scene but remained at the home. When other law enforcement officers arrived in response to reports of a shooting, they found Lane at the residence with his wife's body. Lane was taken into custody without incident. The fact that Lane was a deputy with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office meant that the investigation into his wife's murder was handled by an external agency to avoid conflicts of interest. The Alabama State Law Enforcement Agency, known as SLEA, assumed responsibility for the investigation, a standard protocol in cases where a local officer is involved in a serious crime. SLEA investigators processed the crime scene, collected forensic evidence, and conducted interviews with witnesses, neighbors, and family members who could provide context for the history of the couple's relationship. The investigation established a clear timeline of events leading up to the shooting and documented the prior history of domestic conflict that had characterized the Lane marriage. The forensic evidence at the scene, including the position of the victim's body, the location of the firearm, and the physical evidence within the home, was consistent with the prosecution's theory that Lane had shot his wife during a domestic argument and had not acted in self-defense. Thomas Lane was charged with murder. The case proceeded through the Jefferson County court system, where the prosecution presented the evidence of the shooting along with testimony about the history of domestic discord in the marriage. The prosecution argued that the killing was not a spontaneous act of passion that occurred in the heat of an uncontrollable moment but was the culmination of a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior that had been building over time. The defense explored the possibility of a lesser charge, arguing that the shooting had occurred in the context of a heated argument and that Lane's state of mind at the time was relevant to the degree of culpability. The defense did not deny that Lane had shot his wife but sought to characterize the act in terms that would support a conviction for a lesser offense, such as manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide, rather than murder. The jury rejected the defense's arguments and found Thomas Lane guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crime while falling short of the life sentence that the prosecution had sought. The sentencing decision generated some controversy, with advocates for domestic violence victims arguing that a 30-year sentence for a law enforcement officer who used a firearm to kill his wife did not adequately reflect the gravity of the offense or the breach of public trust involved. The case of Thomas Lane, while less nationally prominent than some of the other cases in this compilation, is representative of a category of police crime that is far more common than most people realize. Studies have consistently shown that law enforcement officers are at least as likely as the general population to commit domestic violence, and some research suggests they may be more likely. The National Center for Women and Policing has reported that at least 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence, compared to approximately 25% of families in the general population. These numbers are widely believed to understate the true prevalence, as the barriers to reporting domestic violence by a police officer are even higher than the barriers that prevent civilian victims from reporting. Officers who abuse their partners can use their professional authority to intimidate victims into silence, can exploit their relationships with prosecutors and judges to discourage criminal charges, and can leverage their knowledge of the legal system to manipulate the process in their favor. The case of Thomas Lane also illustrates the failure of law enforcement agencies to effectively address the problem of officer-involved domestic violence before it escalates to lethal violence. In the vast majority of cases where a police officer murders an intimate partner, there is a documented history of prior abusive behavior that was known to the department, to colleagues, or to family members, but that was not addressed through intervention, counseling, discipline, or removal of the officer's access to weapons. The failure to act on warning signs is not simply a matter of individual negligence but reflects institutional cultures within many law enforcement agencies that treat domestic violence as a private matter, that prioritize protecting officers' careers over protecting victims' safety, and that resist external oversight of officers' personal conduct. Thomas Lane is currently serving his 30-year sentence in the Alabama prison system. His wife's family was left to mourn a woman whose death was preventable, a woman who trusted and lived with a man who had taken an oath to protect others but who proved unable or unwilling to protect her from himself. The case stands as a quiet but powerful reminder that the epidemic of domestic violence in America does not spare the families of those who wear the badge, and that the authority and trust vested in law enforcement officers can become instruments of oppression and death when they are exercised behind the closed doors of the home.